change, shaping change, and storytelling preferred features. So at ThinkPlace, we tackle complex problems, and these problems often involved pretty significant shifts in the way systems operate, so that they can benefit the people that use those systems, but actually people who depend on those systems. So what's interesting about these challenges, really, if we think about it, and we do sometimes when we sort of take a breath and reflect on the work that we do, is that the stakes are actually quite high, right? So changing things that are going to affect human beings in a very real sort of way. So if you're asked to co-design, to drive a co-design process to change the way people experiencing disabilities are supported, or if you're asked to help an entire county transform its outcomes, its health outcomes, when that county is currently ranked 57 out of 58 in the state where that county is located, where do you start? How do you start to design change? How do you grapple with the enormity of the change that we're meant to be helping, supporting, ushering, et cetera, et cetera? How do we know where to begin to intervene, what to do, what not to do, and how do we enroll the multiple actors that are often quite independent, right? Actors that may or may not be bound by organizational missions, or who actually may not even be paid by anybody to be part of the change. How do you enroll those people and get them pulling in the same direction? So there are multiple aspects, right, to the approaches that we use at ThinkPlace. But the thing that I really want to focus on today and really reflect on is the piece that's about using stories to create pictures of preferred futures, right? The stories that we help people shape about the future they want to create, the power of storytelling within that, and the power of storytelling to activate the capacity to dream and to hope. What I want to share is little bits and pieces of reflection that I've been going through in terms of the role of storytelling in the work that we do, and also wondering whether we could actually be activating that role of storytelling even more in the work that we do. So to be human is to tell stories. So stories help us explore who we are. Stories help us explore our fears, face them, think about them, and explore them in a safe way. And stories help us create connection, meaningful connections. So stories are uniquely and intrinsically a human activity. It's a human activity that seems to be universal. The stories might change, but the ability to actually create meaning out of stories is something that we see continuously when we engage people with the sorts of tools that we use to activate that. Stories can create unexpected collaborations. For anybody from New Zealand, you can see that somehow in this story, Buzzy Bee and I think that's Cody the Crank Engine, or Cody the Crank, are collaborating somehow. And who knows how that story came about, right? But what's interesting about stories is that through stories, new realities can be created, new relationships can be created. And somehow in that story, those relationships make sense. Stories help us understand our past and learn about our past. Anybody that hasn't heard about this movie, this is about 3 African-American women who were human calculators and instrumental to the successful landing on the moon, and figures that had been lost in history and contribution that had been lost in history. And stories also help us think about our future, right? So stories are all around us. Stories are something that we live with. Stories are something that we pay a whole lot of money to go and experience. So going back to the 2 projects that I'd like to talk about, plus a few others, starting with the California Endowment. So the California Endowment is a fund, a very large fund in the billions, that focuses on improving health outcomes. And what they decided to do was to fund communities about 10 or so years ago. And one of those communities is Del Norte County, which is where we work in California. And when we started working with building healthy communities, in Del Norte, they were a little way into their journey. So they had been working from 2009 to 2013. And what had happened was that there had been a lot of activity, but when we started working with them, the collective impact table that they have created of all of these change makers and the community service providers had pretty much disintegrated. So there was nobody that was really left that was holding the change. So through some work and to understand what was going on, we helped them really think about their current state, right? So what happened? So why is it that we started off in 2009 with a very big vision of, if you can see the slide on the image on the left, sorry, the right, a very big vision of, I love this place because I can make it great, and this idea that Del Norte County would be a great place to grow up. And somehow, by 2013, that idea had not really been able to hold people together. So there's lots of things that we did, but the thing that I want to focus on is a little bit of a contrast. We came in and we started working with the team, and as part of our stock take, we actually saw that they had been doing quite a lot. So here's an image of just lots of activities, right? Lots of activities around building capacity, around youth, around education, food, and health. But what we started to understand was that they hadn't really created a unifying story that was strong enough, right? So one of the first things that we did, imagine, right, if we show up and the expectation is that we are somehow going to be able to turn the situation around. Big pressure, right? So again, where do you start? And where we started was by saying, right, what is it that we're fundamentally doing, right? What does change look like in real terms? And we said to them, what you're saying is that you want this little girl here to grow up confident and independent, to grow up confident and become an independent adult in the model. And they said, yes, 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 yes. So all of you at ThinkPlace will recognize this tool, right? So what we did is we had them tell a story of not everything that was wrong, because my God, they were drowning in data about all of the things that were wrong, but to get them to tell a story about what is it that we want. And that's quite a significant shift. And I wonder if as designers, that shift comes really easily, because it's the way that we see the world, as something to be changed, as something to be designed. But it's not a shift that comes naturally for everybody, right? So it takes quite a bit of scaffolding to be able to shift people from what is predominantly an analytical mode of thinking, because the reality is the way that we're wired, the way society is wired, particularly in the Western context, is it's all around analyzing the problem, right? Let's get really clear on the problem. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we have seen is that if you add to that the ability to shift into, let's move away from what we don't want and let's move into what we want, we have seen time and time again how powerful that can be to galvanize people and to actually die down some of the noise and fear that people have about the current state. So we started by taking all of this activity and saying, yep, great activity, fantastic, but what does it actually mean in terms of a macro picture? And then the other thing that's quite interesting about this approach is that we all know that you can use it at a different scale, right? So here we were sort of saying at a macro scale, what do we want? But then we knew that there had to be individual things that we needed to do to actually make that future real. And so some of you will have heard about the literacy project, where we have gone right down to say, okay, one of the things that needs to change in the system is that we need to ensure that children are reading at third grade level by the time they are in third grade. So that's around 8 or so. And the reason for that is because when children turn 8, at least in the US school system, they stop reading to learn how to read and they start reading to learn. So if you don't have that basic skill, that is a moment in time when you are in fact going to potentially have not very good educational outcomes moving forward. So again, the power of stories, right? So we went out and we did what we do at ThinkPlace, which is we do empathy interviews to understand parents and teachers. This is Marcus. So Marcus has emerged as the icon, if you will. So now when people think about the initiatives that they're working on to change the outcomes of literacy, there's a very vivid idea of, okay, Marcus was, I think that looks like 6 months to me when we did the research. And now, when will Marcus be 8? When will Marcus be in 3rd grade? And do we know that Marcus is going to be reading at 3rd grade level, right? So what's interesting to me is that, you know, we engage with people who are not designers. So we engage with people who need to activate change but are not trained in the same way that we are, right? And when you talk about these tools that we use, they can sound quite complicated, you know, blueprints and current states and future states. But what amazes me is how consistently, once people get over, and once we do a good job of explaining what the tools are about, people take to them quite naturally. So to me, there's something interesting about, again, going back to that innate human quality of, or human characteristic of being storytellers. Another image that should be familiar to ThinkPlace people, right? We start with the very simple architecture of what is the current experience around the top, what is the future experience that we're looking for, and what are the enablers to make that future experience real. And I've heard that described in different ways, and Del Norte people talk about what must we do to make our dream true. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it did. So what they talk about is, if this is the dream, if this is our hope, if this is actually what we're aspiring to, what do we have to put in place? What do we need to shift to make that true, to make that our reality? Interestingly enough, in Del Norte, one of the things that we also hear is that when you are a community that is constantly being told that you are at the bottom of the barrel, that your outcomes are really bad, that you've got high school absenteeism, et cetera, that starts to really dampen your ability to see yourself in a different way. So the other dimension of this that has been very interesting is people talk about going back to this idea of dreaming, right? To be able to actually say, yep, this all may be true, but we can dream of something better. We can actually aspire to something better. And I'm not sure, again, I think that as designers, there is an intrinsic optimism that we carry around with us. I don't know how much we truly understand that when we're working in some of these communities that have glaring numbers of how bad things are, I wonder if we truly understand how truly that can dampen the soul, like just how exhausting that can be, right? So again, it's really interesting moving people into that space of, yep, you might be exhausted, but actually to design the future is to be optimistic, to create hope, and to dream that things can be better, can be different. So this is a future experience pathway for children age 5, starting kindergarten, a very important part of the journey. And here's another one, age 6 to 9. So this was the first time that this community, they had been talking about the need for literacy for a long time. And as we often see, the idea was that maybe we need more books, maybe we need tutors. So this was the first time that they were able to see this problem in a comprehensive way. But not just in a comprehensive way, in a way that could actually be managed, right? So at ThinkPlace, we talk about managing complexity. We talk about simplicity, the other side of complexity. So I'm really interested in how that actually happens, right? So how is it that these tools both expose the complexity of a situation, but at the same time, provide a way to sort of get a handle on it, right? So the way we phase things, the way that we actually articulate relationships between current, future, and enablers, but also the way we say, look, an experience from 0 to 5 is different than an experience from 6 to 9. And let's actually look at that specifically and really get a handle on what's going on there. Storytelling, I don't think, is only about how we shape and describe future experiences. I think that there is something meaningful that we can do about how we tell stories of evaluating change. And we know that there are methods that actually focus on that approach to evaluation. But I think even looking at the way we create indicators of change and create measurement frameworks can be infused with a sense of meaning and a sense of story. And I think it's important, right? Because all of these tools have to be usable by people way after we're done and we're on to something else. They have to make sense in a way that people can own. So the other project I'd like to talk about briefly is the Enabling Good Lives transformation. And this was about creating a blueprint for the way people experiencing disability receive support from government. And the big shift is that people experiencing disability will have a lot more control of how they receive support. So, to me, one of the more interesting stories that we were told at during this process was, imagine that you need a shower, and it's a Wednesday afternoon, and you really want to shower, but actually the government's told you that your slotted person that supports you with a shower is not due to arrive until the following Tuesday at 9:30 in the morning. Right? So at the moment, the beauty is that the system is changing so that the person experiencing disability can make a whole lot more choices about how they receive support, when they receive support, and who they receive support from. So quite an important shift in terms of really enabling the dignity and control of people experiencing disabilities. So in this particular project, we use something called the Compelling Experience Framework. And some of you have heard that. Folks in Australia, I know that it's not necessarily one that gets used a whole lot there. It's one of my personal favorites, people will know. And there's a whoop from the audience, thank you. And the Compelling Experience Framework, I'll tell you a little bit about it. That was actually originated by a company called Dublin Group. Recently, some folks in New Zealand had the experience of listening to Larry Keeley, who was one of the founders of Dublin Group. And the Compelling Experience Framework, so goes the legend, was actually based on a whole bunch of research about what makes an experience a compelling one. And through this process, they generated a model that says, okay, a compelling experience is one in which 5 stages are designed to perfection. Attraction, how you're attracted into the experience. The entry, how you enter into it. The immersion, the experience itself. How you exit out of the experience, and then the extension, or what happens after that. So if anybody can think of a trip or a wedding is the usual example that gets given. It's interesting to think about, it's not the experience itself, but everything that happens before and after. So what I'm showing you here is most recently we are using the Compelling Experience Framework to unify quite a distributed team. So this is just a little sketch from, not just a little, a integrated, collaborated sketch of the compelling experience for bulk vending machines that will distribute nutritious food. And so this integrates not only ThinkPlace folks, but also folks that really have a bent towards business model design and towards food production as well. So a really effective tool to bring people from different disciplines together and focus them collectively on, okay, what's the experience that we want to create? And what are the enablers for that? How are we going to do that? This was the framework that we used for the Enabling Good Lives. What we had was a group of about 6 people experiencing disability, including families, about 4 providers or so, and then about 4 government officials. So that seems fairly self-evident as an awesome co-design group, and it was. The thing to understand, right, is that it really wasn't a group where the different parties had a whole lot of trust for each other, right? So if we think about the people experiencing disability, right, we're transforming a system, which means that their view of the way the government is functioning now and government officials is not necessarily great, right? And government officials are probably feeling a little bit, nervous. They want to do this, but they're aware of the fact that maybe they're being perceived in a particular way. And then there's service providers, right, who are through this very process being asked to work quite differently. And so the transformation is potentially a threat to the very service provision model that they're a part of, right? So we have a group that actually has, even though a lot of willingness to be there and work towards transformation, inherent in the group a lot of tension in the relationships, right? Add to that group ThinkPlace, who comes in saying wonderful things like, oh, don't worry about the past, and it'll be fine, and just be bold, and design the future that you want, right? So 4 voices that had to kind of develop some trust, but also find something outside ourselves that would be bigger than ourselves, right? That could focus our attention and could take away that noise and amplify the common kaupapa rather than emphasize the tensions or the fears, et cetera, et cetera. So what we used was the ideal experience, and of course, leading up to this, a lot of important inputs, including personas that would represent the diversity of the community of people experiencing disabilities. So once we got over, not got over, but once we actually took the time to build trust, is what I should say. Again, really interesting how this idea of, okay, so now what you're telling me is that I can think about this woman named Sarah who's got these circumstances, and you know what, I kind of know somebody like Sarah anyway, and what you're saying to me is that you want me to tell you a story of what would be great. Yep, that's what we want you to do, right? So that ability to activate, you know, that idea of, yeah, I can tell you a story of what would be awesome, what I would like to see. And through that process, really start to unpack not only the ideal experience, but more importantly, so what are the elements of the system that have to change, right? And what's interesting is here as well is, so here's a couple of the team working, but also being able to present this back to their peers, right? Being able to present it back to them in really simple terms. I shouldn't say simple, I should say human, because it wasn't simple, but in human terms that could be easily understood by all. So once people started working with these personas and these experience maps, one of the things that was very palpable was that ThinkPlace really could sort of blend into the background as support, right? They were owning it, and it was creating, again, this common ground for people from different points of view to be able to work collectively. That's one of the stations. I think we had, we would have had maybe 5 or 6 personas? Yeah, four in the end, yeah. So you can't read this, but I thought I would show this as well, because I think sometimes we might, I don't know, maybe we don't, but if there is a perception that this notion of telling stories only worked for high-level things, it's absolutely not true. At the beginning of the project, one of the areas of contention that we knew we would have to grapple with was going to be the funding model, right, for the new support system. Because either way, right, there isn't endless money, right? So something that we were going to have to go right in there and say is, okay, so what does the funding model look like? You know, do people get unlimited money? Well, no, they don't. So if I say, this is the life I want to lead, this is the support I want, what are the caps, what are the barriers, how does the funding work, right? So really, really contentious. And you can imagine approaching that in the beginning when we actually have not a whole lot of trust between the people experiencing disability, government, and vice versa, and the service providers. So again, you can read this, and you can get a sense of the complexity and the fact that once we actually went through that experience mapping, then people could use those same storytelling tools to address things that were really, really crunchy. Right, so I don't know if the term is recursive. I don't think it is. I'll have to ask John about that. Storytelling works at all different levels. You can think about our big picture. What does it mean to grow up healthy and happy in the noddle? Or you can think about what does it mean to transform a service, or you can think about what does it mean for actually designing a funding model, right? Bringing that notion of people and taking people through a story is an incredibly powerful way to manage complexity and make things meaningful. I just found this again. We talked with the team about superpowers, and it's interesting that power to dream was a superpower that the team identified as being a really important one. With this particular project, what we saw was that there was a huge amount of a sense of obligation, right, on the part of the people experiencing disability. And we had to go through a process of acknowledging that sense of obligation and then being able to move people, scaffold them through from, okay, here's what isn't working. Yes, we have a whole sense of obligation, and how might we move to actually articulating what we want to see rather than what we don't want to see. So some of you have seen this model. This model is an adaptation from a model of experience-based design that dates way, way back to John Kane and Rick Robinson, who first posited the idea of experience-based design very much in a commercial context. So what this model is saying is that along the vertical axis, we are going from concrete to abstract. and along the horizontal axis, we're going from now, future. So the horizontal axis is time. So it's describing the approach that we use to experience-based design, which is we look at the concrete now, we draw insights, we draw models, and as we keep going, we are abstracting the current reality more and more. And then at the very top, we're saying, right, here's current state. How do we shift into future state? What are the critical shifts? And then we're sort of going down the mountain in terms of creating the blueprint of the future. So the part that I'm particularly interested in, that I'm talking about now, is that leap. It's the leap between not just describing key shifts, but actually describing something that does not exist. And again, reflecting on the fact that it's not always something that comes easy for people, right? One of my favorite quotes, maybe it's not my favorite, but one of my go-to quotes when I'm working with people that can't quite make that shift and are still describing a future rather than describing it, I say, well, you know, as a designer, I get to make stuff up, right? So I model just making stuff up, and that's what we do, right? We make up futures, but we make up futures with some grounding in what we think that preferred future might be. So imagine if, one of my favorite design prompts, imagine if, what would it look like, what would it feel like? Okay, let's kind of imagine that somebody is, et cetera, et cetera. What is that going to be like? What's also interesting about, and again, this connection to the power of storytelling, this is a workshop for a project on budgeting services. And this is about, I would say, half an hour into a workshop with people that we had never met before, that had never used this method before. And again, taking a persona and saying, okay, things aren't good now. Your service providers, if you could design the experience that you want, what would that look like? Right? Such a simple prompt. And that coupled with the tools that we use that actually break down those experiences into components that we can design to, I think is probably a combination that, again, we do it all the time, but I sort of think that it's worth us reflecting on that as a really critical think place superpower, I think. In this particular case, this was a workshop where we wanted to get, in particular, the point of view of Kappa service providers. So the other thing that's interesting about this tool is that so far we are finding that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you use that framework to infuse that with culturally specific stories. So we can imagine other worlds, right? We can create other worlds, right? We can use incredible focus, energy, resources to imagine worlds that actually don't exist and to bring those worlds to life to a point that we kind of wonder whether they do exist or not, right? So what I have been thinking about is, some of you will know this is a quote by Keith Yamashita, design is a method of imagining something that does not yet exist and then arranging all the elements required to make it a reality. Design is equal parts embracing constraints, challenging the status quo, and summoning courage. So if we can do this, you might see at the very, very top there's a tree. Everybody see the tree at the top of the little house? That's a fake tree. So that tree has something like, I can't remember the number, 200,000 leaves, imported from Taiwan, sewn into the leaf, into the trunk, right? So if as human beings we have the capacity and we have the courage to say, we need a tree, we have to make that tree, we're going to get the leaves from Taiwan, how might we transfer that sort of courage to create the future we want? And how might we inspire others to be part of that journey, to have that same determination and to focus resources and to focus courage into designing the world that we want? Imagination is its own form of courage. Love the quote, the origin is unfortunate. Comes from House of Cards, unfortunately, but we'll forget that and we'll just focus on the quote. Imagination is its own form of courage. And that is all I have today. Thanks, everybody.